let me add my greetings to all of you here at this beautiful campus of the Pontifical Urban University. At the end of the conference on Saturday, we will thank the many people and organizations who were indispensable to this conference, but there are a few that I want to mention at the outset. Please let me thank our generous hosts here at the Urbaniana University, as well as our co-organizer, the Center for Civil and Human Rights at Notre Dame, led by Dan Philpott. We also thank the community of San Egidio for its central role in organizing the conference, as well as the Knights of Columbus and the Acton Institute for critical support. We also thank our co-sponsors, Christian Solidarity Worldwide, Aid to the Church in Need, the Oasis International Foundation, and Rising Rock Media. We in the Religious Freedom Project also want to extend special thanks to our friends and strategic partners at Baylor University, Professor Byron Johnson, Director of Baylor's Institute for Studies of Religion, who is present with us today, and Baylor President and Chancellor Ken Starr, who's here with us as well, and whom you'll meet on Saturday. We also gratefully acknowledge the support of Tom Banshoff and Michael Kessler, Director and Managing Director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, the Religious Freedom Project's institutional home at Georgetown. Since we are gathered not far from St. Peter's Basilica, I hope you'll forgive me that as we begin to reflect on the issues that draw us together for this conference, the issue centrally of Christian persecution, my thoughts turn immediately to the current occupant of the chair of St. Peter, Pope Francis. As many of you know, Pope Francis has made many statements about the issue of Christian persecution in recent months, and it is fair to say that he has spoken about this issue with increasing passion and forcefulness. In September, for example, just this year, a few months ago, Pope Francis stated that, quote, "Perhaps more than in the early days, Christians are persecuted, killed, driven out, despoiled, only because they are Christians." He went on to say that, quote, "Today, this happens before the whole world with the complicit silence of many powerful leaders who could stop it." This is the key premise of our conference. As Pope Francis affirms, in the face of what is happening before the entire world, there is far too much silence, and there is far too little action, especially by the powerful. Fortunately, this conference gathers both leaders of Christian communities and political and policy leaders from around the world who refuse to be silent about Christian persecution. And in keeping with the theme of our conference, they are taking action to respond to persecution. They have raised their voices. They have protested, they have resisted, and in their refusal to be silent, in their insistence on taking action, they have suffered. One of our speakers was thrown into a metal shipping container in the Eritrean desert when she refused to stop writing and singing gospel music. Two of our speakers survived multiple assassination attempts and the bombing of their home. One of our speakers lost his brother, whom Dan just spoke about, Shahbaz Bhatti, a prominent Christian human rights activist in Pakistan, to a carefully planned assassination by an extremist group. One of our speakers risked his own reputation and his own safety by shielding Muslims from rampaging fellow Christians at the height of Muslim-Christian violence in Central African Republic. One of our speakers is a lawyer who has sought justice for the victims of persecution in India at great personal risk. Yet despite the risks and the suffering and the opposition, they continue to speak out even now. They continue to act even now. And their courageous words and courageous actions have served to extend the reach of justice, peace, and human rights in our broken world. Indeed, through and in the very assaults they suffered to their own personal freedom and human dignity, they have cast a bright light on the true value of human freedom and human dignity. And even when their own dignity was under assault, They have respected the non-negotiable demands of human dignity by extending justice, reconciliation, and forgiveness to others, including often their own tormentors and persecutors. In short, all around us, before our eyes, the swords of many Caesars hang over many Christian communities all over the world. And in the face of this human rights catastrophe, too many are silent and too few are acting. This much many of us already know. What many of us do not know is the variety and creativity and courage with which Christians all around the world are responding to Caesar's sword. This is what our conference will unfold for you in the next few days. You will hear from some of the finest scholars in the world exploring the variety of Christians' responses to persecution and how these responses are having a social and political impact in their societies. And the summaries of this research are contained in the folders that you received when you registered. But you will also see and hear some of these responses come alive in the extraordinary Christian leaders who will be speaking to us in the course of this conference. Again, leaders who have personally suffered the violence of Caesar's sword as a direct result of their open practice and profession of faith, as well as leaders whose entire communities are facing threats to their very survival. And some of these leaders you'll hear from in just a few minutes. Before I turn to introducing a number of these extraordinary Christian leaders who will be speaking this afternoon, who represent regions where Christian communities face some of the gravest persecution in the world, let me make just one further observation. It is most appropriate to hear from these extraordinary Christian leaders and indeed to hold our conference on Christian responses to persecution against the anniversary that Dan just noted a few minutes ago, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration on Religious Liberty of the Second Vatican Council, which just occurred on December 7th. As many of us know, that document is known as our most official papal and conciliar documents in the Catholic Church by the first words of the original Latin version of the document, Dignitatis Humanae, which come from the phrase that begins the declaration, Dignitatis Humanae Personae, the dignity of the human person. That document declared that, quote, the human person has a right to religious freedom. Such freedom consists in this, that all men and women should be immune from coercion on the part of individuals, social groups, or any human power, so that no one is forced to act against his conscience in religious matters or prevented from acting according to his conscience in private or in public, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits. In addition, this council declares that the right to religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person, as known from both the revealed Word of God and reason itself. This right of the human person to religious freedom must be acknowledged in the juridical order of society so that it becomes a civil right. For the purposes of our conference on Christian responses to persecution, Dignitatis Humanae is of enormous relevance for several reasons. First, Dignitatis Humanae was in many respects a Christian response to Caesar's sword and the extraordinarily aggressive persecutorial policies imposed by so many Caesars on so many Christians in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. Indeed, at the very time of the drafting of Dignitatis Humanae in the mid-1960s, many of the most forceful and eloquent advocates of the document were Catholic bishops whose flocks literally lived under Caesar's sword in all of its arbitrary violence and all of the systematic persecution it involved. Not least, for example, the dynamic Archbishop of Krakow, then in his mid-40s, Karol Józef Wojtyla, who later became, of course, Pope John Paul II. Second, if Dignitatis was a response to persecution, millions of Christians were still suffering in the 1960s. It also built on a long tradition of Christian reflection on persecution and on those truths Christians are obligated to assert about human dignity and human freedom in response to such persecution. This tradition long predates modernity, in fact, with ancient roots going all the way back to some of the earliest and most influential church fathers, such as Tertullian and Lactantius. Lactantius, for example, is prominently cited in Dignitatis Humanae. And this tradition was revived in the 19th century by Pope Leo XIII. It was developed in the early 20th century by Pope Pius XI, whose significant encyclical in this regard, Quas Primas, has its 90th anniversary tomorrow, December 11th. And it was further developed and applied to the horrible circumstances of the Second World War in the mid-20th century by Pope Pius XII, including in his hugely significant Christmas address of 1942, which insisted on, quote, the right to worship God in private and public and carry on religious works of charity. This right of religious freedom, Pope Pius XII argued in 1942, was crucial because it is a matter of, quote, giving back to the human person the dignity given to it by God from the very beginning. Third, another reason to highlight the importance of Dignitatis Humanae for our conference, as is clear from what I've already quoted, if Dignitatis was in significant part a response to Christian persecution, it was also a principled response that affirmed the dignity and the right to religious freedom of all people, not only Christians. And as numerous political scientists, such as Samuel Huntington, have noted, Dignitatis Humanae was not just a piece of paper, it was not just a declaration, but it inspired a global mobilization on the part of Catholics and other Christians from the late 1960s right through the 1990s and right through to today to build political orders of religious freedom, democracy, and human rights for all people, Christians and non-Christians. As we gather this afternoon, let us remember the lessons of Dignitatis Humanae. It would not have been easy for the Christians of the mid-20th century, whether in the 1940s, the 1950s, or the 1960s, to have hope for a better world in the midst of world wars, of the Holocaust, of the Cold War. It would not have been easy for them to hope for a better world, a world truly built on the foundations of human dignity and justice for all. But they did have that hope, and they did, many of them, act accordingly, and their actions were instrumental in laying the foundations of the United Nations and of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A fact of this significant Christian influence on these institutions is a fact that even secular historians such as Samuel Moyn of Harvard Law School have gone out of their way to recognize. Christian responses to horrible injustice and rampant persecution, when they are rooted in principle, can make a difference in our world. Principled Christian responses to persecution can not only point to abstract norms, but they also can lay the practical foundations of a better world, a world that all of us can contribute to building here and now. It is perhaps especially important to take this lesson to heart in this season of Advent and of Christmas, a season of joy, yes, for many of us, but one that it will be very difficult for millions of Christians around the world to celebrate, given the exigencies and the pressures that they face. Yet as Pope Pius XII stated with such power in his Christmas message of 1942, in the very dark and very uncertain days of World War II, early days of World War II, the message of this season, even in the very darkest of times, quote, proclaims liberty to the sons of Adam. It promises mercy, love, peace to the countless hosts of those in suffering and tribulation who see their happiness shattered and their efforts broken in the tempestuous strife and hatred of our stormy days. Such words are as searing in their relevance now as they were then. It's now my pleasure to welcome our host for this conference, Don Roberto Cherubini, Director for External Relations of the Pontificia Università Urbaniana. I invite Director Cherubini to say a word of welcome.